tragic event and the complex, troubled man behind it. The Murder of John Lennon by Mark David Chapman.
Right. And our goal here, really drawing just from these sources you've provided, isn't just to recount the facts. It's more about pulling out the key insights,
Helping you understand the man, what the sources suggest about his motives, that fateful day itself, and even how it's all been perceived since.
Exactly. Trying to make sense of the information you have right here.
Okay, we've got a lot to unpack, so let's jump right in.
So maybe let's first just get a handle on the sources themselves. You mentioned the Wikipedia overviews.
Yeah, they're pretty comprehensive. They cover Chapman's life, the murder, the legal side, prison, parole, the whole cultural impact.
And then there's that timeline you flagged up. That seems really useful, laying things out chronologically.
It is. Key life events leading up to December 80, and then everything since, especially those parole hearing dates. It really gives you a framework.
Here, finally, those YouTube transcript excerpts about the film Chapter 27. That's an interesting angle.
It really is, because it tries to get inside Chapman's head, doesn't it? Using dialogue and internal thoughts, either his or the character based on him.
So, taken together, these sources give us a pretty full picture background. Mental state is described, actions, reactions, everything we need for this deep dive, really.
Okay, so starting with the man himself, Mark David Chapman, where do the sources begin his story? Seems like his background is crucial.
Definitely. Born in Texas, grew up mostly in Georgia. And the sources, well, they point to a difficult childhood.
Yeah, I saw that. Claims he made about living in fear of his father, saying he was abusive to his mother, unloving towards him.
Right. And there are these really striking details from early on, aren't there? Like those fantasies mentioned in the sources.
About having godlike power over imaginary little people in his bedroom walls. That's quite an image.
It is. And what's really telling, looking across the timeline of the wiki info, is how early these kinds of contrasts show up in his life.
What do you mean?
Well, the sources mention him skipping classes, using drugs, but then, almost in the same breath, he's described as a born-again Christian.
Right, and a popular YMCA camp counselor, too, nicknamed Nemo.
Exactly. And doing really significant humanitarian work with Vietnamese refugees through World Vision. He was apparently quite successful at it. He even met President Gerald Ford.
So this pattern of extremes, this sort of duality, was there long before 1980.
It seems so. And the sources suggest his psychological struggles really intensified later on. Dropping out of college, this immense guilt he reportedly felt, suicidal thoughts.
That attempted suicide in Hawaii, right? With the car exhaust hose that melted?
Yeah, the sources mention that. And struggles with jobs too, fired, rehired at a hospital. Then that security guard job where he apparently started drinking heavily to cope with depression.
It all seems to build towards that point in September 1980, doesn't it? Where the sources quote him writing to a friend just saying, "I'm going nuts."
And crucially signing it, "The Catcher in the Rye."
Which is the perfect, if chilling, segue into his obsessions. The sources really highlight these as being at the core of his motivations, don't they?
Absolutely. Artwork, Salander's novel, The Catcher in the Rye, and of course, John Lennon.
He was a Beatles fan initially, the sources say, but then turned against Lennon. Why was that, according to the material?
Well, the sources point to a couple of main things. Lennon's infamous "more popular than Jesus" comment clearly clashed with Chapman's religious beliefs, his conversion.
Right. But also Lennon's lifestyle.
Yes, the perceived hypocrisy. Lennon's wealth versus the message in songs like Imagine. The sources have those direct quotes from Chapman.
Like he told us to imagine no possessions, and there he was with millions, laughing at people like me who would believe the lies. That's pretty potent stuff pulled right from the sources.
It really is. And the sources also mention his resentment over the lyrics in the song God, where Lennon says he doesn't believe in God or the Beatles, just himself and Yoko. Chapman apparently felt, who does he think he is?
So it's this mix of religious offense and perceived hypocrisy. But then there's The Catcher in the Rye. How central was that, based on these sources?
Profoundly central, it seems. The sources state he wanted to model his life after Holden Caulfield. He saw the book as having many answers, called it everything.
It's almost unbelievable that his first public statements, according to the timeline, were aimed at getting people to read the novel, as if that was the point.
It really underscores how deep that fixation went. Based on everything we're seeing in these sources, it seems absolutely key to understanding his mindset as presented here.
Makes you really think about that line between identifying with art and, well, something much darker. Okay, let's use the timeline now. The days leading up to the murder. His planning is described as muddled.
Yeah, muddled seems a good word based on the sources, reflecting that internal battle,
Right.
Was it spiritual? Was it for notoriety? He seemed to be wrestling with that.
And he didn't just zero in on Lennon right away.
No, the sources mention he had this list of other potential targets. Paul McCartney, Johnny Carson, Elizabeth Taylor, even Ronald Reagan. He apparently later said he picked Lennon partly out of convenience, but also envy. The main thing was just being famous.
He came to New York in October 80 intending to do it, but left again.
Right, to get ammunition, shows planning, but maybe hesitation too. He went back to Hawaii, and interestingly, the sources say the film Ordinary People actually inspired him to stop his plans for a bit.
And he told his wife, Gloria, about it, showed her the gun.
He did, according to the sources, and they note she didn't tell anyone. Chapman later apparently expressed resentment that she hadn't gone to the police or otherwise intervened.
That's a heavy detail in the sources. And there were other signs, weren't there? Like seeing "thou shalt not kill."
Yeah, reportedly flashing on the TV, on a wall hanging. He even made a therapy appointment but didn't go. Then the timeline shows he flew back to New York on December 6th.
December 7th, the day before. The sources paint a picture of escalating, kind of erratic behavior.
Definitely. Accosting James Taylor in the subway, talking freak speak, offering cocaine to a taxi driver. It sounds like things were really coming undone.
Yet the sources also say he talked to his wife that night about needing help, about his relationship with God.
That mix again. Escalating actions, but also these moments where maybe he could have pulled back. It makes reading the timeline quite poignant.
So now, December 8th, 1980, the day itself, what do the sources tell us?
Well, the timeline notes, that morning he left personal items in his hotel room. The sources suggest it was almost like leaving clues for the police.
And he bought another copy of The Catcher in the Rye.
Yes, and wrote inside, "This is my statement," signing it, Holden Caulfield, doubling down on that obsession.
He spent most of the day near the Dakota, Lennon's building, talking to fans, the doorman.
He actually missed Lennon leaving earlier that day. The film transcript excerpts seem to play on that, this idea of timing, maybe fate.
But later, he saw Lennon's son, Sean, and the housekeeper.
Yeah, and the sources describe him shaking Sean's hand, quoting Lennon's own song, Beautiful Boy, to him. It's just chilling detail.
Then around 5 p.m., Lennon and Yoko Ono leave for the studio, and Chapman approaches him.
Right, asks Lennon to sign his copy of the Double Fantasy album. And that moment, famously, was caught on camera by Paul Gorish.
The sources mention Chapman later said he tried to get Gorish and another fan to stay with him that evening.
Yeah, implying maybe, just maybe, if they had stayed, he wouldn't have done it. Who knows? But it's in the accounts.
And then the tragic culmination. Around 10:50 p.m., Lennon and Ono return.
As they walk towards the entrance, Chapman steps out from the shadows, fires 5 shots from behind, hits Lennon 4 times.
There's that discrepancy in the sources about whether he called out Mr. Lennon first.
Right. Chapman himself later said he didn't recall saying anything and that Lennon didn't turn around, but accounts very slightly.
After the shots, he just stayed there, reading The Catcher in the Rye again.
That's what the sources state. He was arrested right there. No resistance. Lennon was rushed to the hospital, but pronounced dead.
And within hours, Chapman's statement to police, tying it all together, "The big part of me is Holden Caulfield. The small part of me must be the devil."
Directly linking the book and this perceived darkness.
So let's look at the aftermath, based on the sources. The legal process, his time in prison, charged with second-degree murder.
And he confessed to using hollow point bullets, the sources say, specifically to ensure Lennon's death.
And the sources reiterate, his wife knew beforehand, faced no charges, but he later resented her lack of intervention.
His mental state was obviously central to the legal case. What did the sources say about the expert evaluations?
Well, there was significant disagreement, which the sources detail. Defense experts found him psychotic diagnoses like paranoid schizophrenia, manic depression were mentioned, but the prosecution's experts and the court-appointed ones?
He saw him as delusional, yes, but competent to stand trial. That was the key difference highlighted in the sources.
And there's that interesting detail about Chapman himself, isn't there? How he interacted with the experts.
Yeah, the sources suggest he was more cooperative with the prosecution side. One theory mentioned was that he didn't want to be seen as crazy. Maybe he thought the defense was just saying that because they were hired to. It adds another layer of complexity to his state of mind as documented.
So he initially pleads not guilty by a reason of insanity following his lawyer's advice, but then he changes his plea.
Abruptly. To guilty, claiming, according to the sources, that God told him to. Despite his lawyer arguing against it, questioning his competence, the judge accepted the guilty plea.
And at sentencing, he reads from The Catcher in the Rye again, that passage about catching children.
Ties it all back, doesn't it? He gets 20 years to life with mandatory psychiatric treatment.
And he's been in prison ever since 1981. The timeline tracks his movements: Attica, Wende, now Greenhaven.
Spending time in solitary for his own safety, the sources note. That hunger strike being force-fed. Working jobs like legal clerk, kitchen helper.
And being barred from anti-violence classes, ironically, for safety reasons.
Right. And the sources mention those conjugal visits with his wife started in 2014 through the family reunion program. That's quite a detail found in the sources.
Now, about him speaking out, initially, the sources say he refused interviews, claiming he didn't kill for fame.
But then he did give interviews later to Gaines, Jack Jones for his book, Barbara Walters, Larry King.
Which seems contradictory, doesn't it? And the sources note the parole board picked up on that, this seeming interest in notoriety despite his claims.
Which brings us squarely to the parole hearings. Eligible since 2000. 13 hearings so far, the timeline shows.
And all denied. 13 times.
Every single one. His next chance isn't until August 2025.
And the reasons for denial, they're consistent in the sources, aren't they?
Very consistent. Deprecating the seriousness of the crime, undermining respect for law, the suffering caused to Yoko Ono who witnessed it, concerns for his own safety if released.
And his early media interviews suggesting he did want notoriety. The incompatibility with society's welfare, that phrase the board used.
Selfish disregard for human life of global consequence. That really captures it, according to the sources. They acknowledge he might be low risk to reoffend physically, but the motive seeking fame through murder, that weighs heavily.
And Chapman's own statements at these hearings have shifted over time, haven't they, according to the sources?
They have. From claiming Lennon would approve his release, to finding peace in Jesus, to calling the crime premeditated, selfish, and evil. And in 2022, admitting he wanted fame too much, wanted to be a somebody. It's quite an evolution documented in the sources.
And throughout all this, Yoko Ono's opposition has been unwavering, citing safety fears for herself, Sean, and even Chapman, plus those petitions against his release.
It shows the enduring impact. The public memory is still incredibly strong.
Okay, let's shift finally to the cultural impact, and specifically that film, Chapter 27, which the sources delve into. Portraying this event is inherently controversial.
Absolutely, and the sources position Chapter 27 as a biographical drama trying to explore Chapman's psyche, based on that Jack Jones book. Directed by Jarrett Schaefer, who is apparently a fan of both Lennon and Ketcher.
Trying to understand how art could inspire violence.
That seems to be the angle presented in the sources. And the title, Chapter 27, directly referencing Ketcher's 26 chapters.
Suggesting this was Chapman writing his own twisted final chapter, maybe linked to those numerology ideas mentioned in one source.
Potentially.
Huh.
But the film was immediately controversial, the sources make that clear. Accusations of glorifying a murderer, giving him a platform.
That online petition against it, Yoko Ono expressing hurt, Sean Lennon calling it tacky.
And then the physical transformation of Jared Leto for the role, gaining 67 pounds.
Yeah, the sources detail that drinking microwaved ice cream, getting gout, needing a wheelchair, saying he'd never do it again. It shows the intensity involved in trying to embody that role as presented in the sources.
The casting of Lennon is also fascinating, based on the sources. Mark Lindsay Chapman playing John Lennon.
The actor Yoko Ono had previously rejected for another biopic because of his name. Bad karma, she reportedly called it.
But Schaefer pushed for him, felt he had the right quality for Lennon, that sort of street-smart cynicism mentioned in the sources.
Filming near the Dakota must have been incredibly sensitive.
The sources say they shot the actual death scene elsewhere out of respect. The filmmakers claim they weren't trying to glorify it, but explore the psychology.
How was the film received overall, according to the sources?
Very polarized, debated heavily at Sundance.
Mm-hmm.
Critics' scores were generally low. Rotten Tomatoes, Metacritic reflect that.
But Leto's performance...
That was often praised, even by critics who disliked the film. Words like mesmeric, brilliantly measured, utterly convincing appear in the reviews cited. Schaefer's direction got some positive notes, too, for the attempt to get inside Chapman's head. It did win some festival awards.
And it's important to note, as the sources do, McCartney and Ono asking fans not to use Chapman's name.
Right, trying to deny him the very fame he allegedly sought. Which ties right back into the controversy around the film or any portrayal. Is it understanding? Or is it giving unwanted attention?
Finally, the sources put Chapman's crime in a broader, very grim context, don't they?
Yeah, alongside other attacks or stalking cases involving celebrities George Harrison, Selena, Bjork, Rebecca Schaeffer, or figures like Reagan targeted by Hinckley, who also had a celebrity obsession. It frames it as part of a larger disturbing pattern identified in the source material.
So drawing all these threads together from the sources you shared, we've really dug into Mark David Chapman, his background, those intense contradictions.
Those powerful obsessions with Ketcher and his resentment towards Lenin, especially the perceived hypocrisy about wealth and fame.
The step-by-step unfolding of December 8th, the legal complexities, the differing views on his sanity.
His long imprisonment, the consistent parole denials based on the nature and motives of the crime.
And the controversy surrounding attempts like Chapter 27 to portray him that whole ethical tightrope between understanding and glorifying.
Yeah, we've seen how that fixation on the Catcher in the Rye and his feelings about Lenin merged into something devastating, an act the parole board called, quite rightly based on the sources, one of global consequence.
Looking at all this detail from the sources, the childhood fantasies, the back and forth between seeking help and planning violence, the specific obsessions, the debate over his mental state, how we even talk about him now, it really leaves you with some heady questions, doesn't it?
Definitely. About where fandom crosses into dangerous obsession, about mental health and violence, that incredibly complex link, and, well, the ethics of depicting crimes potentially driven by a thirst for notoriety. It's a lot to process.
So after diving into these specific sources, what's the main thing that stands out to you? What are you left thinking about most?